Let me share a story with you. There's actually a real chance that an asteroid could collide with Earth. One day, an asteroid, maybe a kilometer wide, could hit Earth, releasing the force of countless nuclear bombs going off at once and wiping out an entire country or even a whole continent. The most promising solution we have right now, and we've even tested it successfully, is to send a satellite to crash into it and nudge its orbit, but only if we spot it early enough. That's why early detection is critical. And if we stretch into movie-like imagination, nuclear missiles that can reach space could be used to break an asteroid apart and lessen the impact. By the time it enters our atmosphere, it could be broken down into dust or just chunks of rock. Now here's the thing. The satellite technology, the missile technology we already have, none of it was created with asteroid defense in mind. If an asteroid does strike, the damage will be shared equally. Rich or poor, powerful nation or weak, everyone suffers. And yet the only way to prepare is for the wealthy and the powerful to step up and invest in technologies that bring them little direct return for years, decades even. This is what we call a collective action dilemma for humanity, better known as the prisoner's dilemma. So whenever we analyze society, we must distinguish between macro-level utility and micro-level utility, because something might be incredibly beneficial on a large scale, but the collective behavior required to make it happen might be nearly impossible to achieve, simply because it doesn't offer immediate individual rewards. And sometimes those short-term individual gains can lead to very unfortunate outcomes on the macro scale. That's why if you confuse micro-interest with macro-interest, when you're trying to analyze social problems, you end up falling into the same trap conspiracy theorists do, assuming all of humanity as though it were a single living organism. That's mythology. It's not scientific reasoning. So, the systems we might one day use to stop an asteroid, they have huge macro utility, no question. But if they weren't tied to micro-level incentives, humanity probably wouldn't have built them. Ironically, the reason we developed satellites and missiles at all was geopolitical conflict, the Cold War, US versus the Soviet Union. Two superpowers locked in a rivalry poured enormous resources into missile technology, driven by existential security threats. I'm not trying to frame this as some kind of divine plan, though I'll admit it does make you think about providence for a moment, but that's not the point of today's talk. What I want to do is show you how to distinguish between micro-utility and macro-utility, right? So from any single nation's viewpoint, stopping a planet from colliding with Earth is important to them, but they don't necessarily want to foot the entire bill themselves. Yet, by coincidence, the technologies they develop for national security can end up being useful at the macro level. So, if someday an asteroid is on a collision course and we adjust its path with satellites or fragment it with missiles, you can't correctly say that every state developed those technologies specifically to defend against that eventuality that's wrong. It's an unintended but fortunate side effect. There are lots of examples like that in the world. The problem is this: when we evaluate some utility, if we judge it to be a viable mechanism for survival, we must ask how to give incentives for the individual actors, so their choices and actions roll up into large-scale benefit. If you can't find that link, it's very hard to realize in practice. Sure, you can mobilize people through violence or religious fervor, it's human behavior after all, using state violence or religious mission, even when those on the ground gain nothing or are actually harmed. You can organize broad collective action to achieve those large-scale ends. But history shows such mobilizations are temporary, accidental, and unsustainable. They depend heavily on personalities, and that's what we can observe. So how do you build macro utility that is continuous, systemic, and not person-dependent? Here's how. You design the system so micro-level utilities give real benefits to individuals, and those personal gains naturally line up with broad collective benefits. That approach is robust, rational, and sustainable. Let me reiterate. I'm not saying it's impossible to engineer macro outcomes without micro incentives. It is possible, but doing so requires enormous expenditure of energy. You may need collective hypnosis, mass awakening, or mobilization of massive violence, and that is hard to sustain. So some actions fit that model. War, for example, fits that model. But economic development does not fit well with that approach. It doesn't lead to growth. Whereas for economic growth, in a long, sustained game, instead of asking micro actors to sacrifice now and only redistributing later, it's better to design systems where individuals act for their own benefit, and those actions also produce effective macro-level outcomes. In that sense, we need to look at the three revolutions of Bitcoin. The first is the monetary revolution, the second is the energy revolution, and the third is the revolution of identity. If you're curious about this identity revolution, there's a video on the Otaverse channel, a lecture I gave at Seoul National University's Decipher Club. Watch that and you'll see why this third identity revolution is so important. Now let's say a company like EDGC combines genetic data with blockchain and builds a system for identity verification. If the blockchain itself isn't decentralized, it doesn't mean much. It's just a centralized server using genetic data to do ID checks, nothing more. For it to really spread, identity verification has to become something different from what states or giants like Google and Facebook already provide. It has to operate on an entirely different level. I won't go into detail on that here. You can check out that lecture yourself. But for that to happen, blockchain has to be widely distributed. And for blockchain to be distributed, the people running nodes or mining need micro-level incentives. You can't just say, this will be used for ID verification, so please keep and run these nodes because it would be nice. That won't cut it. That's why this all started with people's expectations about price. And of course, that was less about identity or industrial utility and more about the monetary revolution. Think about it. Given US national debt, the dollar's value can only keep eroding. That's a persuasive argument. That's why people bought Bitcoin and why it spread. So whether they were crazy or not, Bitcoin now had a price. And because it had a price, it could deliver macro-level utility. In other words, it made the energy revolution possible. I won't elaborate on that further here. I've argued it enough already. Whether you call Bitcoin the financialization of electricity, or say it's the ultimate consumer of electricity, it's the same idea. So once we've reached this point, we can't just roll the argument back. Because this part is convincing, this does persuade people. But when someone says Bitcoin has no value in the first place, what they're really asking is this. I see the macro utility, but without micro utility, won't the macro utility collapse? That's the hidden question they're asking, often without realizing it. Here's the thing. In the first, the monetary revolution, people believed in it. That's why in 13 years the price climbed all the way up, even hitting 20 million won. Just accept that and you see there's clear macro utility. Now take renewable energy, including hydropower. Solar and wind eat up massive amounts of time and space. They're inefficient ways of producing power, right? Yes, agreed. If we agree on that, then we need a flexible counterbalance. We need a flexible consumer of energy, right? And whether that consumer personally believes Bitcoin has value or not, whether it's just the so-called crazy ones in the market who believe it, as long as these so-called fools think it's valuable and keep buying, all you have to do is produce. That's why surplus electricity or idle capacity can be put to use, instead of wasting rigid fixed space and time in inefficient energy setups. The entire electricity industry becomes more efficient at the macro level. Exactly. And it makes money, right? Now with identity verification, say a company like EDGC comes along, says, here, take our blockchain for ID checks. How many people will adopt that? Instead, you need something already spread, built on Bitcoin itself, or at least anchored to it. Major transactions can be recorded on something as decentralized as Bitcoin, while layer 2 or layer 3 solutions run on blockchains that are decentralized enough. Those moderately decentralized blockchains can then be leveraged by companies to operate identity systems. At that point, it's not about proving I am Ho Chi Minh. What matters in Web3 is proving I am me. So there are multiple layers here, and you don't grasp them all at once. You come to understand them step by step. So when you look at Bitcoin's price today, sure, it may look like tulips, a bubble, or mass delusion. But in reality, Bitcoin is driving three revolutions. A monetary revolution, an energy revolution, and an identity revolution.